Today I want to cover something which frustrated the hell out of me when I was a budding young landscape photographer, period. And that was figuring out what the hell to do with my camera settings each time I approached a scene. Now, when I started shooting for magazines, I was shooting mostly cars and motorbikes. And so it kind of became fairly obvious after a while what I had to prioritize and what I needed to look for. And it was just, I guess it was just experience, just photographing a ton of cars and a ton of motorbikes, that I started to develop a bit of a groove for, you know, what I liked in terms of positioning cars and, you know, exposure settings and all this sort of stuff. But when you are confronted with a landscape scene and you are at the mercy of the weather, you have a selection of lenses to choose from, you have infinite ways that you can approach the scene, and you have a number of different settings on your camera that you can use, it can be a little bit overwhelming figuring out what the hell do I need, what comes first and what comes second. So I had a good think about this the other day, and I realized that whenever I approach a landscape scene, I essentially have 4 questions that I always ask. And I've been taking photos for so damn long that these 4 questions are automatic. A bit like driving a car, you know, at first it's all very, very manual in terms of, or very deliberate in terms of what you're doing with a car. You're thinking about every little thing you're doing. I mean, I took up golf a little while ago, and fortunately I did the right thing and went and got lessons from a pro. Me and my son both got lessons. I really think if we hadn't had those lessons, when I finally went out to a championship golf course with a mate of mine who is genuinely pro level, I would have embarrassed the hell out of myself the first time I got on the first tee. But luckily, that training helped me to actually hit the ball square on down the fairway, fairly close to his ball, which was awesome. Mind you, my game deteriorated dramatically not long after because it was a bloody hot day and I got dehydrated, and that's my excuse, Rowan. So don't tell me to harden the F up. But anyway, I digress. The thing is, when we first get into photography, we vacillate so much over the technical elements of it. And, then we want to start getting a bit more creative. We want to get a bit more adventurous with our images. We want to take photos like the pros do, and we just cannot seem to figure out how the hell they manage to do it consistently, and we can't. It all comes back, I reckon, to these 4 questions. So I'm not going to hold you up any longer. I'm going to get straight to them. I wrote a huge number of notes here on my phone and on my computer about this, and I was going to crap on incessantly about this in great detail, but I think it's better that we just cover it quickly. So the 4 questions are, what am I actually photographing? What is my subject? Now, typically we walk up to a scene and we go, wow, this is gorgeous, I need to photograph this. But almost inevitably, it is not the scene that you want to photograph. There are specific elements in the scene that grabbed your attention. There is that gnarly tree in the corner, those little dams over there. There is that fold in the hill and the way the light's kissing it all, this moss here in the foreground. You know, these are the things that attracted you to the scene. And yes, sometimes you can photograph the whole scene and it will be gorgeous, you know. It's all a matter of scale. You know, you could look over at a huge lake with pointy mountains in the background and some rocks here in the foreground. And yes, you can photograph the whole thing, but just photographing the whole thing on its own won't be enough. You'll still need something else. And typically what that'll be is how the light kisses an element of it, often the mountains in the background, you know, those sorts of things. But I digress again. So the first question is always, what am I actually photographing? What is my subject? You can't just walk up to a scene and go, this is beautiful, I've got to photograph the whole thing, because we see things 3-dimensionally. We also have the benefit of sound and smell and temperature and all this sort of stuff as we move around a scene, and that all augments what we see. The camera doesn't see that. The camera sees and records everything 2-dimensionally, and it doesn't have the benefit of sound and smell and temperature and all that sort of stuff. So what I always advocate is looking at your scene, taking your time and figuring out, okay, what actually appealed to me? What drew me to this scene? Was it that thing or that thing? Is it that in relation to this? Is it this section here? If I sort of look at it like this, is it that section that really grabs my attention? Because more often than not, I guarantee you, when you hone in on specific elements or a specific element of a scene and photograph that and get that right, it's going to have a lot more impact than just photographing the whole thing. Because really, I think that when you just photograph the whole thing, you're not really creating an image. You're documenting what you see. And that's not the same as taking a creative interpretation of what you see. That's just documenting. So that's the first question, is what am I actually photographing? Now, the best way to sort of figure that out, I think, is to grab a lens that's got a bit of range on it. This isn't a good example because this is a 10 to 18, but say something like my 24 to 105 RF lens. That's great because it gives you a feel for what the shot might look like if you go wide and walk around and getting close on something, or what it might look like if you come in a bit tight, zoom in, and just isolate, say, that rock and that tree, So that's a great exercise, is to walk around, look at different elements in the scene and see how they would look in relation to each other at different focal lengths. Now, after you've done that for a while, you start to develop the ability to actually look at a scene and picture those elements compressed with a long lens, or how it would look if you got down low and got that moss on that rock with this gnarly tree in the background. You start to get a feel for that. You don't really need to do the walk around with a zoom lens thing, but it still helps. So I still recommend doing it. This is why I crap on about my Canon 100 to 400 lens so much, because it allows you to pluck out elements of a scene and create something that has impact versus just trying to get the whole thing in. So number one question is, what is my subject? All right. Second one is, how can I arrange the elements that I've chosen to focus on in this scene in a pleasing way? How can I create a composition which is balanced, which appeals to the eye, which draws the viewer in, depending on what you're wanting to do? It might be, for example, if you're shooting with a long lens, you don't need to draw the viewer into the scene. You just want to, it's like this photograph behind me here of this gnarly old tree with the setting sun hitting the grass in the foreground. I didn't really need to lead you into the scene. I just needed to blur out what was in the foreground and isolate the tree and focus on that tree. So, your next question is, how do I arrange the elements in the scene? Now, with that, I could have gone wide. I could have gotten more of the land in the foreground. I could have gotten the other trees that were over further in the distance into the shot, but I just wanted to pluck out that one thing, isolate it, and create something a bit more impactful. So a way to decide what you want to include and what you want to exclude from your scene is, again, walk around, have a look at it. Decide if that background is detracting from your subject or enhancing it. Do you need to blur it out? Do you need all of that to be in focus? Would it look better from down low and blurring out something in the foreground? Would it look better if you climbed up on that rock over there and got up high and shot down? So deciding what to include and more importantly, what to exclude in your image or from your image is super important once you've decided what the subject of your image is. So that's the second question, is how can I arrange the elements in my scene to create a pleasing composition? Now, the third one is the one which a lot of people claim is the big one, and that's light. Obviously, images are created with light. Without light, we don't have images. But there is, continued emphasis on shooting at blue hour or golden hour, this sort of thing. But I think what you really need to ask yourself is, given the fact that you can't control the weather, can't even really predict the weather because it's so unpredictable a lot of the time, especially these days, is what light do I have here now? Where am I best to position myself relative to where the light's coming in from? What's the intensity like? What's the color of the light like? Is it diffuse? Is it contrasty? Is it strong? And based on your feeling about what the light is like at the moment, ask yourself, should I wait? Should I hang around a bit longer and see what the light's going to do? Should I come back early tomorrow morning? Should I wait until, forecast showers come here when it's all stormy and sort of brutish? Should I come here when it's overcast? Would it be better to try and photograph this when it's a foggy morning? Or maybe I should wait until, spring or winter, see what it looks like with all the leaves gone off the trees, this kind of thing. So yes, the light is incredibly important, but probably more importantly is to just observe what the light's doing in your scene and decide how to deal with the light that you have on that day. Now, I've had countless situations where I go to a scene, I know what I want to photograph. I've figured out what my subject is. I've decided pretty much how I want to arrange the elements in the scene, and all I'm left with now is a problem of light. The light's too flat, the light's too dull, the light's too blue, whatever. The light doesn't look good. So I have limited choices there. I can either photograph the scene as it is, or I can wait, see what the light does. And I had a classic case of this recently where I was out shooting in a boulder field with my son, and the light was really rubbish. It was just grey and flat and dull, and it just wasn't doing anything. We had a couple of little bursts of light, but it got to a point where we gave up and we just thought, bugger it. My son was dying to go to the toilet. and the sun was pretty much, down behind the hills, and I thought, bugger it, we'll just go. And then as we packed everything up and walked back to the car and went to jump back over the fence again, all of a sudden there was this tiny little break in the clouds, and this orange light just burst through and lit up a tree and backlit this boulder, or sidelit this boulder, which is what I'd come there to photograph, was boulders. And I was hit with this awesome light that lasted for about 2 minutes and then it was gone. So, in that case, I didn't wait for the light. I'd given up on the light, but luckily I hadn't left yet, and so the light still came. So that totally transformed the image. Okay, so light is really important, but let me emphasize, you don't need to always shoot at golden hour. You don't need to shoot at blue hour. There are plenty of situations where dull, diffuse, overcast light is more appealing. If you're in a heavily wooded area, if you wanted to photograph, a waterfall or a stream or something like that, chances are you don't want strong, bright light coming in from one side unless it's all foggy, and the fog diffuses the light. That's beautiful. But, if you don't have the benefit of fog, then maybe strong side lighting is not what you want. Maybe what you want is an overcast day at 2:00 in the afternoon, and just creating like this big softbox effect. And that will probably give you much, much better results. And there are situations too where strong, bright, middle of the day light can still work too, especially in very harsh, dry environments. I mean, that can really create a punchy and powerful and impactful image. So it doesn't all have to be at dawn and dusk. Yes, those times of day are beautiful, but they're not always ideal. Okay, so the first three that we've covered are, what am I actually photographing? What's my subject? The second thing is, how can I arrange the elements within this scene using a combination of position, where I am, focal length, which lens I'm using, angle, high, low, whatever. How can I arrange those to create an appealing, balanced image? What should I leave out? What should I sort of include in the image? Step back, or do I go further in? That kind of stuff. So your subject, how you arrange the elements. The third one is, what is the light like and what can I do about it? And the fourth one is, and this is the one where a lot of amateurs get really stuck, is how the hell do I decide what's more important here? Is it my aperture? Is it my shutter speed? Is it the ISO? Which one do I choose? Well, the first part of the answer is, generally you don't just choose one. You choose two and you let the camera figure out the third one. Because almost inevitably, you'll have two priorities. And often they're complementary. Sometimes they compete with each other. But typically when you walk up to a scene, you'll have two priorities. I'll give you an example. If I'm shooting, say I'm shooting a waterfall in a stream, and I want to blur out the water, all right? My first priority is going to be shutter speed. I want a low shutter speed. Maybe say 1/10 of a second to get just a bit of blur in the water, but still get some definition in the streams coming over this rock. So I want a low shutter speed. That's really important to me. But my almost equally important desire might be that I want to get as much of this in focus as possible in terms of the depth of field. So I want a low shutter speed. I want a very narrow aperture, like a very small aperture, say f16, maybe even f22, although I wouldn't typically shoot on that. But say I want f16, 1/10 of a second. They're my two priorities. Well, then I might not have enough light in this scene to shoot at 100 ISO, which is nice, low ISO setting, very low grain, very low digital noise on the image. I might have to bump that up to 200 or 400 or more to be able to get those other first two things I need. Contrast this with, maybe I'm photographing a waterfall and I want to freeze all the droplets. I need to shoot at 1,000th of a second. But I don't want to have any digital noise in this image. I want it to be pin sharp. I want to have no noise in here at all, no grain in my image at all. So I really want to shoot at 100 ISO, but I also want to shoot at 1,000th of a second. Okay, well, a couple of things come into this. First off, I can't choose the aperture now because I've already determined that high shutter speed, low ISO are my priorities. So the camera's going to say, well, buddy, if you want those two settings, I'm going to have to open up the lens to f2.8 or else we're not going to get a correct exposure. It might even be that f2.8 is not enough. It's still a dark image, in which case you might have to shoot this at a different time of day. You might have to shoot it when you have more available light. Or maybe you just cannot do that shot the way you want to do it. Something's going to have to give. You're going to have to bump up your ISO a bit to compensate so that you can at least get a correct exposure. So, there's always a couple of priorities. Typically for me, my number one priority when I shoot landscapes is I always want to shoot on 100 ISO if I can. I would at least like the option to blow up my image billboard size if I want to. I'm not a pixel peeper, but I do love to see, I think when you have a lot of detail in your image, especially a landscape image, when you can see the little bits of barbed wire on that farm fence way off in the distance, it's very, very pleasing to me to be able to see that level of detail in the image, because then I actually get to see things that I didn't even see with my naked eye. I get to zoom in on the image and go, wow, I didn't even know that there was that little thing over there that looks so cool, So for me, ISO is always my number one priority. I always want to shoot on 100 ISO. My second priority is almost inevitably how much or how little of this scene do I want in focus. Now, like that tree shot back there, I shot that probably at f4 with my 100 to 400, probably at 400 mil. So I really wanted that grass blurred out in the foreground. So I wanted a very wide aperture, f4 or 5.6, whatever it was at the time, and 100 ISO. So then I just let the camera decide what the shutter speed was. I had the camera on a tripod. I didn't care if it was 10 seconds or 60th of a second, whatever it is. But those were my priorities. And that is usually what my priority is first ISO, so I get the clearest resolution on my camera, on my R5. Second one is deciding whether I want very little in focus or whether I want a lot of the image in focus, a lot of the depth of the image in focus. I want a lot of depth of field. That's my second priority. And then the third one is, well, you can be whatever shutter speed you like. I don't care because I'm using a big, heavy tripod. So whatever it is, I'm fine with that. Now, the difference is if I'm shooting handheld, and there have been times when, certainly in the early days, where I'll go out and either can't be bothered using my tripod or I don't have it with me. That's very rare now. In fact, I never travel without my tripod and I always pull it out of the car. But there have been situations where I photograph something without a tripod and with a long lens, and there's no movement there that I need to freeze. There's no action that I want to control the movement of, whether it's freezing it or letting it flow like, say, a stream. There's none of that. But just by the sheer fact that I'm holding a long lens, photographing something far away, that long lens amplifies movement. So if I'm holding the camera and the camera's just moving a fraction here, it's moving feet at the other end of the scene, and camera blur is a real problem. I mean, I've got an R5 which has got in-body image stabilization and my lenses are all stabilized, so that certainly helps a lot. But not every camera has that, obviously. Not every lens is stabilized, and so there will be situations where you want to shoot with a long lens typically, but this can happen with shorter lenses as well. And the shutter speed that you need to use to be able to get what you want in focus is going to be a high shutter speed, just simply because there's the risk of camera shake. So shutter speed is going to be your priority then, even though if you had the thing on a tripod, shutter speed definitely wouldn't be your priority. It would be, say, ISO and depth of field, your aperture. So it all comes down to just deciding what matters most here. Do I have movement? If I have movement, do I need to freeze it or do I need to allow it, the movement? If I need to allow it, well then how much of it, or freeze it, once I've decided that, how much of the image do I want in focus? Is that important? Is that more important? In which case then my aperture is more important. Do I care about grain or digital noise in the image? Is that a priority or not? If it's not a priority, well then you can basically let that do whatever it wants all the time, and then you've got free reign with your aperture and shutter speed pretty much. You can decide whenever you like, to change those around and just let the ISO take care of itself. And a lot of people, I think, do that. Certainly when I'm just doing run and gun stuff, walking around with my camera, that tends to be what I do. I tend to think, well, I don't care what the ISO is. I'm not trying to create an epic landscape shot here with a camera on a tripod and going for maximum sharpness. I just want to be able to capture stuff. So I let the ISO do what it wants. I'll probably set my shutter speed to something which counteracts hand holding and freezes movement of kids and stuff running around or whatever. And, adjust my aperture to f8 so I get a lot of it in focus, and then let ISO take care of itself. But this is how you deal with this conundrum of this exposure triangle, is just simply look at your scene and go, what's more important? Is how much of it's in focus important? Is controlling the movement that's in the scene, either allowing it to blur or freezing it, is that more important? Do I need to counteract, possible shake in the camera? Is that important because I don't have a tripod? Well, then you've answered your questions. If it's depth of field and stuff, it's aperture. If it's controlling movement, it's shutter speed. If it's digital noise in your image and suppressing that or not caring about that, well then, ISO is your priority. You might say, I need very low noise, so I want the lowest ISO possible. Or it might be, I don't care about digital noise, so leave the ISO on auto. Play around with the other two. That's how you deal with that. So anyway, I've crapped on for long enough, probably far longer than I wanted to, but those are the 4 questions I always ask myself when I approach a scene. What's my subject? How can I arrange the elements? What's the light doing and how can I deal with it? And what is my exposure priority? Aperture, shutter speed, or ISO?